Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam. I'm co-chair of the PRCA Corporate Group, and I also run my own boutique public affairs and communications offering, Do Different. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Just so you know, we are recording this session for YouTube, and we'll also be promoting it on LinkedIn, Twitter, and elsewhere for those who couldn't make it along today. At least I hope that's what we're doing. As a quick introduction, the PRCA is the world's largest industry professional PR body, representing some 35,000 members in 70 countries worldwide. And as part of its global offering, they run 50 or so sectoral groups, with each one committing to hosting 4 events per year. I've been involved with 2 others before now. The first looked around whether organisations should take a public stance on the big issues of the day, and the second considered how to deliver bad news in the wake of the budget. We kept both of those sessions to 45 minutes in length, and that format seemed to work really well. So we're going to replicate that today, which brings us to around 5:15 p.m. In brainstorming topics for our third online event, we chose to dive into the narrative around climate change and how companies can make sure strategies and communications make the impact that they need to, which is why we've teamed up with the sustainability group today, because this is relevant to both of our audiences. You'll no doubt be familiar with some of the terms like COP26, decarbonisation and race to zero. But whether you're the person who's responsible for creating a communication strategy, or you're just getting yourself up to speed on the issues and the tactics, we've brought together a panel to discuss whether your company or your client should get involved. And if the answer to that is yes, then how to stand out in all of the noise. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our 3 guests today who we're really chuffed to have with us. We have Claire O'Neill, who's the Managing Director of Climate and Energy at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She's also the Senior Advisor for Energy and Climate at Public Policy Projects. Prior to these roles, she had lots of experience in politics. She was an MP from 2010 to 2019, during which time she served as a policy advisor to the Shadow Chancellor, George Osborne, Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Defence Secretary, Philip Hammond, Government Assistant Whip, Rail Minister, Advisor to the PM, David Cameron, and most recently as Minister for Energy and Clean Growth and the former COP26 President Designate with the right to attend Cabinet. Previously, Claire worked for Bank of America, Credit Suisse, and McKinsey and Company. Adam Lake is Head of Climate Week NYC and leads on communication strategy for the Climate Group in North America. That event brings together international leaders from the worlds of business, from government and the sector to speed up climate action. And it takes place annually to coincide with the UN General Assembly. Prior to this, he served as European Head of Communications for the International Rescue Committee, acting as a member of the senior management team. Other roles include Head of Communications for the UK poverty charity Turn to Us, Advisor to the Press Complaints Commission, and Communications Lead for Total Politics magazine. And last but by no means least, we have Eva de Keyser, who is a Senior Sustainable Development Manager at Alpro, a plant-based food pioneer since 1980. I, for one, love their products, and you should give them a try. She is leading their sustainability strategy with ambitious commitments for sourcing, operations, and packaging. She kickstarted her career as a project engineer for sustainable agriculture at Ardo, a global partner in the production of fresh frozen vegetables, herbs, and fruit for retail, food service, and the food industry. That's quite a mouthful to say. Following her studies of bioscience, engineering, and 2 years of scientific research at Ghent University, Eva has focused on sustainable food production for the past decade. And as I'm sure Claire will plug today, we need more and more businesses to get involved in the challenges that face us all. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Robert Metcalf to chair the discussion today, and then I'll be back for the audience Q&A. So if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please do drop them into the chat function, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. Yeah, very pleased to be here. My name's Rob Metcalf. I'm interim chair of the PRCA Sustainability Group. I think we could probably talk for about 5 hours on this subject. So let's cram our 25 minutes with as much information as we can. Claire, I'd like to start with you. Everybody knows that COP26 is coming.
Yes.
But how significant is it from a business point of view? It's a big thing on the political, on the world stage. Governments are talking to governments. But from a business standpoint, where does it sit?
Well, So great. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. It's fantastic to join you. So I think the fascinating thing is I have never seen in many years of COP attending and COP watching that the business community quite so energized about COP, both in terms of wanting to know what's happening, wanting to be there, wanting to be part of it, wanting to be demonstrating that they're part of it through their comms and PR. The slightly tragic point, Rob, is COP is constructed to be almost exclusively a private club, which has no real way for businesses to dock in. Businesses are not part of the negotiations. The core negotiations are intergovernmental. And for many years, the question has been, how does the business community get more involved? It's a bit like trying to solve the COVID pandemic by only having governments and NGOs involved in the solution, which is clearly bonkers. So World Business Council, which works with 200 plus of the world's most sustainable businesses, and many others, are very much sort of trying to get into the tent and trying to show that in many cases the business ambition is running much further ahead than the government ambition, and businesses have the opportunity to problem solve and to show what good looks like, and to actually move the dial, as I'm sure Eva can tell us, through their work with their consumers, through what they have to show their investors, and through their advocacy work. And so I think it's a bit tragic actually that we don't have these docking points for businesses, but certainly, and there is a question actually about whether COP is fit for purpose, and that's a very long conversation, but certainly I've never seen businesses quite so desperate to get inside the COP tent, and I think they have something that's really powerful to say.
That's very exciting, and we'll ask Eva that question in a moment. I was going to come to Adam next as somebody who manages or promotes or runs or looks after a focus event in Climate Week. Again, how do you attract businesses to engage with that particular focus, the build up to it and the delivery of activity around it?
Well, I think like the first thing I'd say, it's been a really interesting few years in the US where my focus lies, because we've just had Donald Trump. And so, you know, having worked in lobbying in some way, shape or form for over a decade, it's usually, you know, you work with the businesses to get the government to do something. Well, it's sort of turned on its head in a way. We've got great groups like We Are Still in the US, where, to be honest, we've had to admit that businesses just need to go and do it alone. The government's not going to be the people to help them, to move them along. And actually, I don't really think it's a case of us trying to convince businesses. I think the case has been made to businesses that it is smart. I think that shareholders are also demanding that businesses do the right thing. And so really, I think, to touch on what sort of Claire said, the interesting thing now is not to convince businesses what to do. It's not necessarily even to convince governments, because a lot of them are coming out with interesting things. The UK is coming out with some good stuff, EU today. It's about getting businesses and governments to work out, how do we do it? I think within this sector, we're all getting a little bit tired of talking about commitments. And it's nice when we hear 2035, 2050, 1.5, 2 degrees. But that's great. We need to see a little bit more activity on the ground. Like, how do you connect business investment, certain decisions in terms of infrastructure with the commitments governments are making? I think one of the things that we've always tried to do at Climate Week NYC, we run it every year alongside the UNGA, is actually try and have the space for businesses to do that thing. It's that peer-to-peer sharing. There's a lot of will there. There is actually a lot of money now. There's a lot of investment. It's about sharing best practice and making sure that businesses understand the best way to sort of take this forward. So I guess to answer your initial question, how do we get businesses to sort of follow on and play their part? I think they're there. I think they're really coming along.
Excellent. Well, I mean, that's brilliant news. How does that sit with you, Eva, from your experience within a big multinational business, admittedly one that is built on sustainability for kind of 40 years or so? Are you seeing that enthusiasm right across the business to develop this further, to take this further?
Yeah, well, I can comment on two things. The one is on communication and what the momentum that the COP is offering now for us as a business is to be part of the conversation. And you see indeed that all kinds of organizations and all brands and companies want to be part of this conversation, but it is confusing for a consumer, because in fact what they want, what we see that our consumers want, is to make informed decisions on their purchases, on their consumption, and to take into account the environmental impact. But it's not so easy because environmental impact is a complex system. And as a business in our communication, we have the challenge to translate this complexity into reliable and easy to understand relevant information for the consumers. But what we see today is that there is no alignment in this. There are no guidelines on how do you do this communication. It's not harmonized across Europe. There are no fair ways on how to measure and to report on this. And that's why we really believe that we need, as a company, we need processes to measure and budget for our environmental impact and to make it in a fair and comparable way. And we really believe in science, that this must be a science-based, harmonized system, and organizations or networks such as the Science-Based Targets for Nature that are working to close this gap can really help us in doing so that as a company, we move away a bit from the random targets, where now we are a bit left free to what we do. If you don't look at carbon, for carbon, it's already quite well established, but at all the other impacts, think of biodiversity, water use, land use, how will we integrate that and make sure that as a company you can budget for that and you can make sure you do what is good enough for the planet in line what is internationally agreed. And I think there the COP and the governments can play an important role in supporting this and making this, supporting this process and guide companies on how to do this.
Well, I know that one of the things that perplexes a lot of people is what the standards actually are and the definitions are and how they vary from interpretation to interpretation. But if we're looking for a standardized approach, is that something that is going to come out of COP and governments talking to each other, or perhaps, Claire, is that something that's going to
well, actually, it is happening. It's again, it's not happening at COP. I mean, the thing that happens is COP. Actually, it doesn't even happen at COP. It can happen all year. Is that governments come forward with their nationally determined contributions, their sort of stake, if you like, in the carbon reduction process, and they're very variable. There's no common standard for those. But Eva's quite right that there is a proliferation of reporting measures now that companies can voluntarily follow or choose to follow. There is an underlying greenhouse gas protocol that was sort of the accounting system for carbon, if you like, and increasingly work is happening to try and align around science-based targets for sectors, around the so-called TCFD, the voluntary carbon disclosure, risk disclosure. But Eva raises a really important point as well, which is increasingly it's not just climate action that companies are looking to report on. It's nature action, it's water action, it's sustainability of supply chains. So there is a real plethora of stuff that's out there. And one of the big, and the good news is there are big efforts being made working with companies to develop sort of reporting mechanisms to share all of it. It's almost like barcoding. You know, we have a barcode system that you can tag lots of information on, whether it's water reduction or sustainable supply chains. What we lack is the protocol and the database to do that, but we're developing that with our members, so it is out there. But you know, companies report on all kinds of different things, and partly it's what their consumers want, and in a way that is a bit of a wild west because there aren't great standards. Climate's coming together, greenhouse gases, but the rest of it, as Eva says, you have a bit of freedom to do what you want, which is not always a good thing when it comes to consumers. They want more standardization, I'd say.
Well, I wonder whether that leaves, I mean, well, I assume it does leave the market open for kind of greenwashing on a grand scale. You have some brands, some corporates that are doing everything very scientifically and reporting what they can and not reporting what they can't, and others who are leaping onto the bandwagon with all sorts of claims. I mean, do you see that, Eva?
Yeah, well, definitely. I think that's the big risk we see now, that it's not the brands or the companies always that shout the loudest that are doing the most efforts, what lays behind. And what I feel that within our Pro is that the more you work on it and the more you start setting targets and having action plans, the more visible it also becomes what are the challenges in your value chain. And maybe the more careful you become in communicating, because you know the big work that is still ahead of us. But also, I think what is also a risk is in this race to zero and making it and consumers requiring it more, is that it becomes a race, while actually it should be a journey where we are all together, and we should collaborate more together with all the stakeholders and see how we can do this together. And regulations can help to streamline, but also what I already mentioned, like the science-based targets, is also important to create the fair and level playing field for transparent and honest communication.
Adam, do you agree with that? That the playing field isn't level at the moment, and you can seize an advantage if you're willing to be less than scrupulous, perhaps?
Yeah, I think, climate is cool at the moment. That's a huge threat as well as an opportunity. I think, we certainly see that Climate Week NYC, some of the people that come to us and you look into it and you think, hang on a minute, that's not quite right. To be honest, a really good example, I think, is looking at sort of equality, diversity and inclusion. I think after Black Lives Matters last year, we saw a lot of companies coming forward with their big statement, putting something on their website. Actually, with a little bit of scrutiny, some of those organizations actually had very, very bad records on how they treated their staff, on things that they have done in the past, and sort of putting out some comms on the issue, because that's what everyone's talking about on Twitter. That's not the good thing to do. It's actually only going to raise where you are falling short. I think that's the same thing with climate. You can't have a comm strategy to satisfy sustainability. It needs to be something that is decided at board level. It needs to go through like a stick of rock through the organization. And I think a sort of word of warning for organizations that aren't doing the right thing at that senior level, that don't have that support. If you're coming out with adverts, if you're coming out with this, that, the other, talking about, how you really believe in this, and this is heart of heart stuff, you're going to come a cropper on it. I mean, one specific thing I've seen, there are some organizations that I've been speaking to where maybe the department within that organization are doing the right thing, but the organization as a whole is fundamentally against what we want to achieve. Yeah. And environmental justice is the thing you're going to be hearing so much about this year. This is the idea of sort of environmental racism, as it were. Some people might say, how can sustainability be racist? If you look in America, where factories have been placed in specific towns and villages because that's where Black people live and they could get away with doing it, that's what they mean by EJ. In the UK, it's more of a class-based thing, taking away jobs from people on lower income. Lots of companies that don't have a good record are really talking about that this year, because it's easy for them, because it sounds great. It sounds like they're doing the right thing. They're the sort of organization that we're working from. But if you're an oil company talking about EJ, that you just it's tip of the iceberg stuff. So I do think it needs to be, greenwashing is such a big thing. However, you've got people like us in the panel and a whole other industry out there. It's really obvious when it happens and you just cannot get away with it.
Can I jump in on that? Because it's a really fascinating question. I get personally very sick of seeing adverts in Heathrow for oil companies who are using algae to solve a problem when 99% of their investment spending is going on new fossil fuel development. On the other hand, I feel very sorry actually because there are some energy companies who I think are on an absolutely genuine transition. I mean, I would say, BP and Shell are absolutely genuine about this transition, and you can see it in the numbers, but you can also see it in this corporate conviction that Adam talks about, and yet no one ever cuts them abroad. So there's no slack whatsoever. And I think we've actually got to get away from this green or black binary thing, because that 95% of fossil fuel assets are owned by national oil companies who don't give a monkeys about reputation or shareholders or consumers in many cases. So I think there is an element of sophistication starting to come in, but there has been a lot of greenwashing. My sense now is that there is now much more data and transparency about what companies are doing. And so you saw with Exxon, I mean, that was just a classic disaster, to Adam's point about companies saying one thing and doing the other, where they haven't drunk the Kool-Aid. It's not in any way part of their corporate strategy, and that's quite obvious, I think. So I think we're getting a bit more nuanced about it. And there is a premium. I mean, increasingly you see, certainly in the investment world, this huge premium for sort of ESG funds and share prices responding because companies are being perceived as green, and this is exciting. And often it's because they've got great products, but there is definitely a halo, I think, around some organizations.
Well, that I guess partly raises the question of who do you choose as your partners? Who do you align with on a national or global scale to demonstrate your credentials or to advance a partnership? Is it United Nations? Is it WWF? Is it Extinction Rebellion? Where are the credible connections there? Ava, is that something that gives you pause for thought?
Yeah, I think the key is in collaborating, and then when you collaborate with NGOs or like WWF, there is also always a high level of transparency involved. And I think that is important when you collaborate, that you share, you inspire, but also transparency on what you do. And it's, yeah, I think activists and NGOs also have their role to play in the world and in this debate. They should be loud. They can speed up the change, but it's important to keep on understanding each other and to work together to move it forward. Because I think where they can also help is to work on the public opinion, because there also sometimes we see a bit in opposition on the pressure from consumers can be very high and they ask all kinds of questions, but they can focus on very detailed points that are not necessarily where the biggest impact sit. For example, for us as a food company, we get a lot of questions about our packaging, why we are not packing in glass, for example. But if you look at the math behind and you look at the true impact in your product, the packaging, actually it's less than a fifth, it's less than 20% of what the product represents. Looking at the sourcing of ingredients, it's a lot higher, it's almost double the impact, but it's further away from the consumer's mind. So they are requesting us to put something in glass. We know if you do the math that glass is not as sustainable as a drink carton, that maybe will end up as waste, maybe it's incinerated, but still it is a better choice and it's a more sustainable choice than a glass bottle. But it's difficult, it's complex to bring this to the mind of a consumer. And if you only follow the consumer's pressure or questions, then you end up, it is a balance you need to make. And I think an organization such as WWF has the credibility to bring this message and to support us in that.
It's a great point, and it gets to, it gets back to this transparency and measurement point as well. And it's a bit like, the fossil fuel debate and oil companies, I mean, most of the pandemic was won with oil-based products, let's face it. And so again, there's an element of sort of communication and trust, and often there is just a mistrust, let's face it, about, I mean, I as a former politician find it incredible that people are prepared to trust government with a decarbonised future and not some of the businesses who perhaps might have CEOs in post a bit longer than prime ministers. But there we are, that's perhaps a bit of a parochial comment.
Adam, a focus event gives the opportunity to raise the educational stakes, I guess, and get some of these messages out into the public domain and promote an advanced understanding of some of these issues.
Yeah, I think there's multiple things going on. I mean, this is the 13th year that we run Climate Week NYC. It's my personal fourth. There's a very different process going on in the whole year it takes to organize it. I think sort of 4 or 5 years ago, in terms of the sponsors, in terms of the people you'd be talking to who would be on stage, you're dealing with the sustainability teams, the ESG teams, and any sort of funding, any interest, it's strictly in those teams. Big passion of mine, and something we've really worked on hard in New York City, is to try and engage people at grassroots level across the 5 boroughs of New York, and allow everyone to engage. It's not this sort of C-suite high level thing all the time. And I don't think one has caused the other, but I think happily the two things have come together. We've seen, I mean, 4 years ago, there were, I think, 50 to 100 events taking place around New York City. We're now looking at about 500 events take place as part of Climate Week NYC every year, not just in New York, but around the world. So the big companies, it's no longer just the ESG team, the sustainability team who are interested. You've also got the central marketing team. You've also got the CEO wants to be there. The president of the company wants to be around the table. And so you've got this really, really interesting thing where you've got the general public and the most senior people in the organization actually sort of combining and crossing back and forth through events, through sessions, workshops, etc., etc. So I think it is an interesting thing. It is different, and so that creates a different opportunity. It's one that could fall apart if there's nothing backing it up. But actually, the fact that you've got these interactions, it means that there's less risk of that happening.
I can really build on that, because if I see the evolution 10 years ago as a sustainability manager, you were quite on an island. You were doing your job alone, setting your strategy, trying to convince people to do stuff. But now for Alpro, we are just a team of 2, I think, to work on sustainability. But it's not like that. We are just like the tying up the ends and working with all the different departments to integrate the action plans into their strategy, because that's the only way it will work. It doesn't work if you sit alone on a chair and you think, what should we do about sustainability? Because you cannot do it alone. You need to work with the buyers and decide how they will change their buying policies. We need to work with our R&I departments on how they will work on packaging, with the factories to implement it just everywhere. And we see it now more and more embedded throughout the full organization, and that's when it becomes interesting.
Absolutely. Look, we're alas running short of time. One perhaps final question for each of you, before we go on to the Q&A and more questions. If we have a brand, if we have a corporate entity that is doing the right thing, that has a track record of sustainability, that is coming to this with the right motivation, is on the right course, what is the one thing that it should be doing in communication terms when something like COP26 comes along? Is there something that a comms department, a brand team can do that is going to be a positive thing at this time? Let's come to you, Adam, first of all, to put you on the spot.
I think the biggest mistake I see, even from some of the biggest organizations with the best paid comms people in the world, is just look outside, don't just look inside. If you've got a big announcement about something, whether you're planting 1 million trees or whatever you're doing, look outside. Are other people doing it? Are other people announcing it on the same day? I think so often organizations, quite rightly, they're very proud of the successes they have internally, but they think that they're going to go externally, they're going to release something, and then suddenly all the media is going to be talking about this massive turnaround. And it's just not the case. Be realistic, partner with other people, and be humble. These are all reasons to go further and not reasons to be negative. Let's be positive, but keep your eyes open on the outside world, not just internally.
Thank you. Ava, be realistic, be humble. Does that fit the Alpro strategy?
I think so. We are trying to be, for us, we always think we need to be more vocal and more proud of what we do. But the one thing I would say that I'm always also pushing for with our marketing departments is on transparency. Be transparent in where you are on the journey, and don't make it only a good news show. Just show where you are, what are the challenges ahead, and be proud of what you have already do, how you act, and inform your consumers about it.
Claire.
I'd agree with both of those points. I'd also make the point that COP is yet a moment, and COP is a bit like a sort of fox in a hen house. Everyone goes bonkers for 2 weeks, and actually the narrative is very much usually, oh, it was all a terrible failure. The G7 had some great announcements in there, but most people took it as a climate failure, even though it wasn't. For me, actually, there's something, if you've got a great message and it's embedded in your organization, just be bold, be proud. Too many organizations, I think, are being chased out of talking about that track record because the world has decided that it's never enough. And actually, again, I'm not for a moment suggesting this is a private sector-led solution. My goodness, we need regulation. But there are companies doing amazing things. Companies saying, we will be carbon negative by 2040. We'll take back every molecule of carbon we ever emitted. No government does that. So I think companies actually have got an opportunity to be really proud of what they're doing, but it has to be authentic. And it has to start in the boardroom. You cannot have a sustainability officer and a comms team jumping over in the corner, because that will get found out pretty quickly.
Well, whatever happens at COP26, and it's an exciting time to be in corporate and brand communications and to be talking about sustainability. Thank you very much to all of you for your contribution so far. And over to the other Adam for some Q&As.
Cool, thank you. A couple of questions come in. One from Rebecca. She asks, do you think companies are motivated primarily by reputation when it comes to developing their sustainability strategies? Is this an opportunity or a risk for the communications industry? Perhaps one for Adam?
Yeah, you know what, I think looking at some of the biggest companies, the really, really big US-led multinationals, I have to say, hand on heart, I really believe the people we deal with really believe in it. The teams, the investment, the decisions that they do, I really believe that. I think sometimes at board level, maybe it is reputation that tips the balance. But I'm a big believer that in life, it's about what you do, not always why you do it. And I think if the right teams are getting the companies to do the right things and it's genuine, I don't care how they convince the CEO to do it. So yeah, I really do believe that 9 times out of 10, the people really do believe in what they are fighting for.
There's a really good, I've actually got right in front of me a piece of research by BCG, who did some work a few years ago on this, because it kicked off a whole piece of work. The number one driver of corporate turnaround was CEO conviction, interestingly. So the companies who really doubled down on this, you can pick, companies like Unilever, Ava, I'd be interested to know if it was a question at Alpro, was the CEO just basically decided, Iberdrola is another example, this is how it's going to be, and took the organization on a journey. And then the other thing that's starting to play into that space is FOMO. So now companies increasingly want to know what their competitors are doing, and they see extraordinary successes, certainly in some of the consumer brands. But I would challenge, I think the leadership historically actually tend to come from the top, which is a good thing, but clearly you can't just clone ambitious CEOs. You've got to have a broader group. And of course, investor pressure is also starting to play into it.
Yeah, I would like to add to that maybe that I would think you have both type of companies and actions being taken. Some are because of the conviction of the higher management or CEO. I do think it's important, but I also think that some companies do see now the pressure on reputation and think, oh, we are lagging behind, we should do something. And that in starting, maybe the first motivation is not for doing the good thing, but when you start with it, when you start, you recruit a sustainability manager, you make your strategy, you see what is possible. I think that year after year, you will grow more into it and you will shift towards starting it maybe for reputation, but wanting to do what is good in the end.
Cool, thank you. Another question for you, Eva, potentially. It says, many brands seem to be looking to leverage COP26, which feels more about communication strategies rather than any dedicated long-term commitments. How can we ensure brands have a longer-term view?
Yeah, I think there it has to do with setting targets, having not just a communication and a wild commitment, but really looking what is behind it. And there, I think, again, transparency on how you set targets and doing that in line with international agreements is important, so that you don't do just better, but try to do what is good enough.
Yeah. A question from James, potentially for Claire. I was recently challenged by one of my senior team to challenge the business at every level on delivering real sustainability. Where or how is this most effectively done?
As a process, gosh, that's a great. Well, I'm glad we've got people like you who are being invited to challenge. I think the best way to do that, James, I think, is to have an informal conversation with as many people you can talk to and ask them how often they think about sustainability first when they wake up in the morning. I mean, there is a sense, I think, that as we've talked about, there's a growing sense of companies doing the right thing, reporting against the right measures, but are they really seeing the change? And by the way, are they seeing the opportunity? Because the other thing, we always talk about this as if this is some sort of, I mean, of course, this is a global imperative. Carbon dioxide levels are at 4.5 million years high, for God's sake. But there are massive opportunities there. And are people coming to work every day thinking, how do we benefit from this? How can we give our consumers a better product as well as a lower carbon or more sustainable product? So I think for me, a lot of it's informal conversations about how serious do you really think it is. I mean, I often do a thing where I chair these panels of global leaders and I say, right, hands up who thinks we're going to get to net zero by 2050, and not many hands go up. And that's a real challenge, because if the world thinks we're going to overshoot, then we better start doing some very radical things very differently. So I think it's actually asking some of those tough questions, and also potentially looking at what competitive companies are doing and saying, why are they doing that and how could we do differently? But I'm glad people like you are being asked to run the challenge. That's great.
Another question in potentially for you, Claire, from Charles says, I wanted to ask about guerrilla tactics, like what Greenpeace did yesterday when they dumped 600 kilograms of plastic waste outside Downing Street while the police just stood by and watched. Are they ever effective?
God, I mean, it's I speak as an old lady now. I mean, there was a time when I was a member of Greenpeace, and actually, if anyone sees someone who looks a lot like me holding up traffic with an Extinction Rebellion protest, it's my daughter. And I used to say to her, darling, you could just come home and have a cup of tea with the Minister for Climate Change. It might be a lot easier. Yeah, of course it does. I mean, look, these organisations have an incredibly important role to play in that sort of Overton principle. But of course, they thrive on controversy. And so when you then, I've had people from Greenpeace tell me that no private company should ever be involved in planting trees to offset carbon because it's a bad thing to make a profit off nature. I just find that, what do they think governments are doing when they're selling off their forests for palm oil? I mean, this is really, so I think there is an ideology that I find really quite tricky, but we need these organisations to continue to raise the temperature and to campaign, and, and some of them will come into the tent and have a sensible conversations and others won't, but at least they'll be clear about what they stand for.
Yeah, I just want to add something on that as well. I totally agree with everything that Claire's saying. I think there's a real danger if we treat climate action like it is some sort of faith where you have to be ideologically pure.
Yeah.
I think the vast majority of people are decent and want to do the right thing, but they get scared when they feel they're being condescended to or looked down on. And when they see these things saying you must completely cut out meat or never fly again, I think there's a real danger in actually turning the tide against the work that we're trying to do. So I do think sometimes these things can be counterproductive. There is a place, like Greta Thunberg has undoubtedly brought something to global attention, and that's a positive thing. However, a lot of what we're doing, completely agree with Claire, if you don't work with business, we're not going to fix it.
Yeah.
And we shout and shout and shout. At the end of the day, we're actually just destroying our only option we've got.
We're also slowing down progress. So there is this we are out of time for solutions, and people telling me that the private sector shouldn't be involved in natural climate solutions, that's just mad. I mean, I'm sorry, that is incredibly unhelpful and counterproductive. So I think I'm fed up with perfect being the enemy of the good. And actually, interestingly, I feel many companies have been scared by this. Because you sponsor an exhibition and you get I used to spend my life in fear of having someone from Extinction Rebellion super glue their hand to my face, which was their promise because I was the minister for fracking. Whatever. Can we have a conversation about gas in the mix, please? So I think again, we're out of time for some of this, and yes, we need to be pushed, and yes, we need to be challenged, but can we just focus on the facts, please, and be proud of what many companies. I have not yet met a company, with the exception of one oil and gas major in the States, who I thought, you're actually full of BS. I mean, every company that we deal with has the conviction, is making the changes, and in many cases is being far more transparent than almost all governments around the world.
Maybe I also wanted to, but going back to the question on what you can do and how you can start, I think there are also many tools to measure where you are. Like think of starting to work with science-based targets, measuring your carbon footprint, or doing B Corp assessment. working with the SDGs. So there are many platforms that you can use as a start, like to see a bit where you are and bringing that insight above and presenting that to the teams. It will immediately trigger some points like, oh, we have that score in that area. How can we improve? What can we do? How can we contribute? And I think that's definitely something I'm really convinced that everybody in an organization, we can find for every role how they contribute to the sustainability targets if you set them right. And to create that ownership within the organization is very important.
I've got 4 minutes left and I've got 5 questions. So I'm going to pick these two and just throw it open to whoever wants to answer it. So how much damage do you think revelations like Exxon's cover up of its research into climate change and its program of disinformation does the wider ability of companies to appear honest actors in the environment debate?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does a lot of damage because again we're quite crude in this distinction, and interestingly, there's nowhere. All these companies that make these great carbon pledges, they're not captured anywhere. There's no global hopper with all these numbers in it. So for all the pledges, we never go back and ask companies to demonstrate they've done it. It's not that they don't want to, it's just there isn't a mechanism. So the trust is very low. And I think we have to find ways, and COP is one of them, to demonstrate that organizations are actually delivering. That they said they'd do it, and look, they did it.
And kind of following on from that, there's a question saying, can we really believe in market private sector-led sustainability when, for example, you see the CEO of Danone sacked for choosing to prioritize sustainability over short-term profits? Note, Danone was still very profitable when he was sacked.
I don't want to answer. It's got to be a mix. It's got to be a public-private mix. And at the moment, the global system is all public. And we have these action coalitions, but we've got to find a way to bring them together. And by the way, it works. So a bit of regulation, like the phase out of fossil fuel engines, has a really disproportionate impact. So I think it's a constant mix in the best case.
We've spoken about obviously the importance of like ESG in communications departments, but there's a question here saying, what role do you view the legal profession as playing into embedding sustainability, e.g. contracts, which again flows on from what we just said?
I think a really direct way you can do that, it's about supply chain. I think that's a big thing that's coming through. It's not enough to make sure that your organization on its own is doing well. If there are kinks in your supply chain, there will be problems. So making sure that you feed that through to your contracts is a really great, it's a great start anyway.
Yeah, I would say on that, putting it in your contract is one thing, but you also need to collaborate with your partners in the supply chain, because just putting things in your contract without supporting your supply chain is also not always the answer. And it is quite complex and challenging once you move into that space in looking further than what just happens in your own control. It becomes, for me, that's one of the biggest challenge moving forward, how to get that all on one line and how to upscale what you can do with one supplier to your full supply chain and value chain.
Cool. A last minute final question from me. So lots of the people who are on the call and who'll watch this afterwards on YouTube, heads of PRs, heads of comms, heads of public affairs, if you were advising them on where they should be focusing their efforts what tactics should they be using around things like COP26? Should it be fringe events? Should it be media? Should it be social? Should it be spent on advertising? Or is it much bigger than that? Any thoughts? And maybe one for either Adam.
Happy to jump in first. Going to give it a shameless plug here, but I think this will be a generally useful thing. Climate Week NYC is doing over 500 events. We've got 18 senior level events of companies. Everything is free. Everything is open. We've got the biggest companies in the world engaging and talking about for the first time what they're doing. They're flagging what they're going to be talking about at COP26. So I do think like going on the website, climateweeknyc.org, checking out and having a look at things is a really good starting point and a really good plug.
It's an excellent plug. Yeah, I think Climate Week's great, by the way. I don't think you mentioned I also advise FTI consulting, Adam. So we could plug away, but I actually think there's a consistency element. So Yeah, by all means use COP as a proof point, but this is a part of a longer term plan. What is it you actually want to be saying? And I think collaboration in this space is also incredibly important. There's, whether it's supply chain decarbonisation or working together on targets, this is a real opportunity actually to work with competitors, with suppliers, because you can amplify your messaging together. So I don't think you have to go it alone in many of these important moments.
And Eva, any final thoughts from your side?
Yeah, my ad was going to be that you need a combination of all of that. It's no longer only the traditional channels to which you reach consumers and bring this message. You need a combination. And what I there also see, because as a sustainability manager, often you are more in the corporate communication, but we see there that there is more and more an overlap where we used to write sustainability reports really for corporate stakeholders. Now you write it also so that consumers that are interested can also read it and can enjoy it and can understand what is in there.
Cool. Thank you all to all of our panelists, and thank you all for joining. If you want to get in touch with any of us, please just ping us on our LinkedIn profiles. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, Adam.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.